All right, so we are on our last chapter of Shirley Guthrie's Christian Doctrine, and where did we leave off?
To hell, there's a no.
414, 2019, on D.
D. All right.
2D. 2D.
2D. Okay.
2D.
So
You know
hope,
what?
2D. We're in
4A. If nobody knows, if nobody's following me, I'm just
4A.
No, it's 2D. 2D.
There's a comedian in every group. All right, so we're in the second dimension, hoping God's power over death, not on our own power. And in this section, remember, it's Christian hope, hopelessness, and false hopes. And Guthrie is continuing with this pattern throughout his book, that a lot of times he will build up and he'll talk about incorrect or partial answers as he is moving to what he feels is the correct answer, or the answer within the Reformed tradition. All right, so hope in God's power over death, not our own power. So when we think about the afterlife, our hope must be in the power of God, right? We cannot resurrect ourselves. We just cannot do it. We don't have that kind of power. I mean, it's an illusion if someone can do something like that. But again, this is where our hope lies, right? So if we have hope in the resurrection, it's putting our hope within God's hands. Because when we're dead, we're dead. That's it, right? So if we believe in the afterlife, the hope must lie within God,
Right.
because there is no other way that we know of. All right, so that rounds out. So we have hope, Christian hope versus historical optimism, Christian hope versus historical pessimism, hope in the power of God over the power of death, and then hope in God's power over death, not our own power, right? So as Christians, we must rely upon God, right? And that includes the hope of the resurrection, right? It is all God, and we just place our hope within God. All right, so Roman numeral 3, some guidelines for asking the right questions. A, we must not want to know too much. All right, and this kind of works along with, remember, as Guthrie said, as we try to come up with these illustrations on what we think something is like, the resurrection is like, or Jesus's, the resurrection on the cross. We have all of these different illustrations, but if we go too far with them, it begins to unravel. Yeah, it begins to unravel. So we must not want to know too much. If you think about it, we know very little about the afterlife, and the Bible is in ways cryptic about it. We don't know a lot about it, so we must not want to know too much. I mean, Jesus talks about the resurrection. Jesus talks about a kingdom that is coming, but that's really about it. We like to add our own little pieces to it.
A lot of it.
We add a lot of pieces to it.
Like Dante and his...
Dante, yes, Dante adds a ton of pieces.
He filled up all the...
Right, he filled up all the missing spaces.
Guys.
That's right, Dante does a great job. And then we do a good job. I mean, we are beings, we like to think that we're thinkers. So we want to know answers. Mm-hmm. We want to know answers. And perhaps this is done intentionally, that we are not supposed to know everything about. Jesus tells us more how to live our lives here on earth than Jesus does about what it's going to look like afterwards. All right? So we must not want to know too much. So we hold on to the hope that there's life after death. We hold on to this hope, but we must not want to know too much about it. Like, don't worry about it. Don't go too far. It's there, but maybe it's left like that on purpose, that we should not know too much about what it's going to be like. B, biblical language about the future is metaphorical or symbolic. Yes. Or, maybe one day when we get there, it really will literally be a mansion with many rooms. I don't know. Again, these are what we would consider educated guesses. We think that it's a lot of metaphorical language. You know, the book of Revelation is loaded, and I mean loaded with metaphorical language. And it's done like this intentionally. You know, the author of the book, you know, cannot just come out and say, you know, I think, you know, Domitian is the Antichrist, and Rome is nothing but a gigantic prostitute. You know, because if ever the day came where he was taken in by the Romans, you know, they would have strung him up.
On a book signing tour.
Yeah, he would not have lasted very long on a book signing tour. You know, so there's reasons why it's done cryptically. There's reasons. Prophets, you know, it's done by humans, but it's also done by God, right? Prophets write in metaphors and symbols also, right? They don't necessarily understand everything that God is telling them. Mm-hmm. God might say, you know, the angel might say, write this down. God might say, jot this down on paper, on scroll. Mm-hmm. What does it mean? Don't worry about it. It's not for you. Yeah. Yeah. You know, so again, a lot of it is metaphorical or symbolic. A lot of it we just have to kind of, you know, move through it. And it doesn't mean that we're going to get it right, you know, but it is what it is. It is what it is. And again, perhaps the metaphors and the symbols are meant to keep our knowledge at bay, or maybe they're meant for us to figure it out. I don't know. I mean, it doesn't mean that we don't study it. It doesn't mean that we don't try to figure it out. But does it mean that we're going to have in black and white in front of us the right answer? It's, you know, depends on what tradition you're coming from, because there'll be lots of different answers down the line, right? So the future is metaphorical or symbolic. C, Scripture offers us not one but several hopes for the future. And what on earth is Guthrie talking about? Several hopes for the future. So in the writing of the Old Testament, for the most part, there is no hope at all for life beyond life in this world. Individuals may hope that God will bless the righteous and punish the unrighteous in this life. But after this life, there is no heaven and no hell for any real life at all. Everyone who dies goes to the same place. And what was that place known as?
Sheol.
Sheol, right. The land of gloom and deep darkness, as Job puts it, a region where all the dead have a kind of shadowy existence, completely cut off from God and forgotten by God. From the Psalms, Israel's hope for the world is not a hope for new heaven and new earth that will come at the end of the world history, but hope for coming of like a new king like David, a son of David, who will bring a political kingdom of prosperity, justice, peace, and true religion for all people within history. Toward the end of the Old Testament period, Israel's hope for the future changed when the people were carried off into exile, right, which was in Babylon. It became clear that this life is not the godly who prosper and the ungodly who suffer, but just the opposite, right? There was no longer any realistic hope for a Davidic kingdom before which the nations of the earth would bow. Then arose an apocalyptic hope for a great cosmic battle between God and all the demonic forces of evil at the end of history, at the end of which God will be victorious. At that time, all the dead will be raised to everlasting life, or to shame and everlasting contempt, from Daniel 12:2. To receive the reward or punishment they did not receive in this life, and God, not this or that political leader, will establish an eternal kingdom of righteousness beyond history. In the New Testament, the book of Revelation develops this apocalyptic hope for the future in greatest detail, but it is also the framework for Jesus' own proclamation of the coming kingdom of God and for the theology of the New Testament writers. As a result of Jesus' preaching, and especially his death and resurrection, hope for a final world judgment, the resurrection of the dead, and a coming of a kingdom not of this world became the foundation of Christian faith. It is important to note, however, that there is no agreement in the New Testament about just when and how all this will happen. Jesus himself seems to have thought that the end of the world and resurrection of the dead would come very soon. In his earlier writings, Paul still expects the end to come soon, but in his later writings seems to postpone the end to an indefinite future, out of Romans. So when we think about the end, right, and that's what we're talking about here, there are several hopes for the future. And the concept of the afterlife, and we've talked about this before in different classes, kind of evolves for the Hebrew people, right? It starts out that there is no afterlife, right? You start out in books like Ecclesiastes. It's like, enjoy those simple things here in this world, because when you're gone, well, you're gone. Then you get a Sheol concept, right? And that's, well, everyone goes to Sheol. It's kind of gloomy, it's dark, maybe God forgets about us. And then you get this concept of a judgment, right? As Guthrie brings out, as the Hebrews are moved into captivity into Babylon, their world is shooken up, right? Think about it. You live in one place. This is your home. You feel that God put you there. Now you're dragged off in chains, right? Not only that, the temple is mashed to bits, right? I mean, it's very dreary.
Right.
Your hope is probably dashed into bits. But you get this discussion about, well, you're going to come back one day, right? But that's like 73, 74 years later. That's about 2 generations of people, 1 generation gone, and a couple who will know nothing but living in Babylon. Right? Think about that. 74 years, that's about one of our lifetimes.
Right.
Yeah? So the youngsters, the seniors, middle-aged people will never go back. Youngsters, perhaps, if they're lucky, have good health, right? Eat an apple a day, right? Have good people like Suhail there to fix them up. They might make it back, or they probably won't, right? So what you have is this huge shift, right? This is where we see the Hebrew people begin moving from an oral history to a combined oral history plus written history, right? They decide, you know what, maybe we should take care of these things. Maybe these things should be put into a canon, right? And of course, it's not like a bound canon like we would think of a book, but, like a collection of scrolls. Mm-hmm. Because what if we do get wiped out totally? All this is going to be gone. Because if it's just oral, where is it?
Ether.
It's ether.
Right.
Yeah,
It's
in the cloud here.
right. It's in there. Right. This is the cloud. Right. It's in
But that cloud
the.
doesn't last long.
That cloud doesn't last
I
long.
mean, what's the name of your great-grandfather?
Luigi.
Great-grandmother.
I have no idea.
Right.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's it.
You remember grandparents.
That's it. And maybe
but
great-grandparents.
beyond that, it becomes
Very
You know
shady.
their name. We don't even know how they look like.
That's
anything
right.
Like this,
That's right. Very good from the mindfulness class.
I mean, there's no cameras. There's nothing to
That's it.
keep this. It's gone.
That's it. Even if they did have cameras. I mean,
Yeah.
think of it this way. You think about when we go back, it gets very fuzzy. Pictures now with computers, like maybe my kid or my kid's kids, they'd be able to go back pretty far.
And see your
But-
Facebook.
Yes, your Facebook. But it will only be a photograph.
Yeah.
Right.
You still won't know anything about them. You can research them and know stuff about them, but you don't know them.
Yeah.
You don't know them, right? And so there's a point, and then if all of them are gone, that's gone too. The knowledge is gone, right?
Mm-hmm.
So we see now this huge shift, right? We now see the rise of the Pharisees, of a group of individuals who take on this role of protecting this information, both the written tradition and the oral tradition of the people, right? And then you get the rise of this understanding of this great eternal judgment, right? Good get judged positively, the bad, well, not so good, right? But Jesus comes within this lineage, right? This is why we must be really careful when we do study groups like the Pharisees that, we don't throw out babies with bathwater. Because Jesus comes from that tradition. This is the tradition he comes from. He rejects a good part of it. But, there are Pharisees who are good people. Not all of these people are looking to just, kill Jesus. There's a portion of them who convert to Jesus' teachings. There's curious ones. And there probably are members of the Pharisees who just teach and want to live, live and let live. So we have to be careful. But the reason why I did this little history lesson is I want you to see that there is this progression of an understanding of what the future is like when you look at the ancient Jewish history. And I bring this up because as Christians, this is part of our lineage, right? It's a shared history. Just like when we look at church history, we can say, well, we're Protestants. Well, good for us, good for you. But there's a long period of time where we have a shared church history until it branches off. And then when it branches off, doesn't mean that you still don't have to go all the way to the bottom, because that's our history too. It's our history too. And as a good student, it doesn't mean that, well, we're this side. It doesn't mean that you don't study other experiences. You still want to study the other experiences. Because guess what? We don't get it right all the time either. Right? It's humans. It's people. The church is full of people, of broken people, and that's the church. So it's our shared history. It's our shared history. So Scripture offers us not one but several hopes for the future, right? Of course, as Christians, we cleave to the clearest revelation, and that is what Jesus teaches us, right? But it's important as students of the Bible that we understand that this was a process, right? Not all Jews believed this concept. There are still Jewish people today in the postmodern world that do not believe in an afterlife. They don't. And it's not as clear and cut as everyone would like it to be, right? The world in places is not black and white; it's shades of gray. It is what it is.
50.
What's that?
50 shades of gray.
Ah. All right, we're going to skip that one. That's probably not appropriate for Bible study. All right, so let's go to D. The best insight we have into what God will do is found by looking at what God has actually done. Right? So if you want to look at trying to figure out what God will do, well, let's see what's God's track record. Right?
Oh, this is not very...
Correct.
In the Old Testament, it's like, smite and smite.
Yeah, that's right. And we must also understand that Jesus, is not just this hippie that walks through fields and runs his fingers through tulips and, Jesus gets upset too. Jesus looks at this poor fig tree and it's not even the right season, and kills it because there's nothing on it. Jesus goes into the temple and sees what's going on and starts tipping over tables and chasing out animals with whips of cords. Jesus gets mad too. It's, yes, God is love, but again, remember what Guthrie taught earlier, love also comes with justice, right? So we must be careful not to pigeonhole. But yes, God's example in the Hebrew Scriptures can be very rough at times, and downright scary. So put the fear of God is sometimes the fear of God. But we must look at God's track record, and it kind of gives us some clues. So you look at it and say, okay, well, talk to me about our resurrection, right? What does it mean? Well, what does resurrection mean for Hebrew people, right? And we're going to get to this further when we get towards the end, when we talk about resurrection, right? So the Hebrews have always believed in a bodily resurrection, right? They did not believe that, when we are resurrected, it's a spirit that is resurrected. That's not a Hebrew concept. That is a Greek concept. And if it's your belief, that's great. But if you want to look and see what is taught from a biblical perspective, it's bodily, right? So when Jesus teaches this is what he teaches. It is this physical resurrection. His resurrection was physical, right? It was not, what's the term, ethereal? When it's spiritual. What's like a ghost? Is it ethereal?
Ethereal.
I think that might be the term.
So.
Yeah.
So how do we know this? Right? What does he say?
Touch me.
Touch me.
Right.
Touch me. Feel my...
Give me some food.
Yeah, right. He eats food. Right?
Yeah.
Touch me. He walks. He talks. Right? Well, I guess a ghost can walk and talk. Although I've never personally seen a ghost.
I have a
I'm
joke
still
about
here.
that, but it's a bad one.
It's a bad one. We'll wait for after class.
Yeah.
So when we study the final days and what the future for the church, it's a good thing to go back and look at what God has done so far, right? Again, it's just doing good Bible study by doing that, and that's just one example of this. So we must look back at how God has acted in the past. What kind of things have we seen before? Doesn't mean that God is going to continue moving or doing the same thing, but we can kind of understand the nature of God
Right.
from what we have learned and read prior.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's
butterflies.
what's that?
Butterflies.
What?
Caterpillar.
Yeah.
Comes up.
Yeah.
Butterfly. I'd say that's
Metamorphosis.
yeah, it shows what kind of change we might be in for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is a wild thing to look at.
Yeah. I mean,
Considering you go from a thing that looks like a worm, a caterpillar, and now
Right.
you're this butterfly, I'm still amazed. Like, that never gets old for me,
yeah, no.
to look at that process. Never gets old. It's
Right.
amazing.
Right.
It's absolutely amazing. I
But
mean,
this was cremation was a big thing, because people said if you cremate my body, how is God going to put it back together
yes.
and give my body resurrection?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
And for many
churches
years,
had to.
Christians would not cremate. In fact, the ancient Jews,
But yet, when the funeral parlors wanted to stuff them full of chemicals, they were fine with that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Anyway.
yes,
Not really fine.
yes. Well, it's interesting you bring that up. You know, for the ancient Jews, they would not cremate themselves.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
that was left for the enemies. And it's more of a modern thing that we do it. But when you think about it, what about you could be swimming out in the ocean and over comes Jaws and gobbles you up, and you still believe in the resurrection. I mean, if God can do that, I mean, yeah, particles in the sea.
Didn't he raise an army of stones at some point? Don't worry about it. I'm
Yeah.
sure he
Yeah,
can,
right,
he
exactly.
can handle your
Exactly.
incinerated body just
Right.
fine.
Exactly. And that's the thing, and we can get so bogged down in these details, like, it's like we can sit there and I don't know if this is true or not, and it might be true, but there was like this group that got together to try to figure out how many angels could stand upon the top of a pin.
The
Right.
Byzantine.
The Byzantine,
Yeah.
like the head of a pin.
Yeah.
I mean, and it's just like, we laugh about that, but guess what? We do the same thing in different forms.
Right.
We always get caught up with the minutia about it,
Yeah.
instead of like looking at the big picture. So one of the best insight we have is the Bible, and to look at what God has done in the past. And that includes Jesus.
Yeah.
Have you found it?
Yes, in Wikipedia. Is the reduction ad absurdum challenge to medieval scholasticism in general? Answered angelology in particular is represented by figures such as Duns Scotus and Thomas Aquinas. It's first recorded in the 17th century in the context of Protestant apologetics. It also has been linked to the fall of Constantinople with the imagery of scholars debating while the Turks besieged the city. So you think about all of these things, but you're not defending yourself, you know, that's it.
So instead of defending themselves, they're trying to figure out how many angels could sit on the top of a pin.
So in modern usage, the term has lost its theological context and is used as a metaphor for wasting time debating topics of no practical value or questions whose answers hold no intellectual consequences.
There you go.
While more urgent concerns accumulate. So it starts with Aquinas, Summa Theologica, written in 1270, and includes discussion of several questions regarding angels, such as, can several angels be in the same place?
So interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. There you go. All right. So, well, let's press on to Roman numeral 4. Christian hope for the world, the Last Judgment. All right. Will it always be this way? A world in which the little drama, like in Genesis, tells us took place in the beginning, of human history, is repeated over and over again in constantly new variations, with ever more disastrous consequences as long as human history continues? Will history always be the story of human beings' rebellion against God and enmity towards one another, until we finally destroy the whole human race and take our planet with us? Nope. He's coming to judge the quick and the dead and create a new heaven and a new earth. That is the promise we have to try to understand in this final section. So the Last Judgment. When we hear this phrase, even those of us who have not seen Michelangelo's picture of it in the Sistine Chapel or other medieval pictures of the last day probably think of a stern, sword-wielding Christ separating those on the right who are floating up into rosy clouds from those on the left who are being dragged down by hideous demons into all kinds of horrible torture.
Yes.
Why is it? Why is it that those at the bottom of such paintings are so much more interesting than those at the top? Is it because the blessed are so sweetly and boringly passive, whereas something is at least going on among the damned? Or if we are to think biblically about the future of the world, we have to get rid of such half-pagan mythology and think in a quite different way about what is going to happen on Judgment Day. In the biblical world of thought, the judge is not primarily the one who rewards some and punishes the others. He is the man who creates order and restores what has been destroyed. Right? So that's the primary thing. The first thought that comes to Christians when they think about the end of history ought not be anxious or vindictive speculation of who will be in and go up and who will be out and go down. Right? It's not our primary, it shouldn't be our primary thought pattern. It ought to be thankful and joyful thought that we may be confidently looking forward to the time when the will of the world's creator, reconciler, savior, and renewer will prevail once and for all, when justice will triumph over injustice, love over hatred and greed, peace over hostility, humanity over inhumanity, the kingdom of God over the powers of darkness. The last judgment will come not against, but for the good of the world. It means that evil will be condemned and rooted out of God's good creation. Declaration of faith. That is good news, not just for Christians, but for everyone. All right, so this is the primary thing. You know, when we think about the Last Judgment, as Christians especially, this is what we must focus on. It's a good thing for us, right? It's God coming and putting things back the way they were meant to be. It's the restoration of the world, right? So when you think about things, you can go as far back as the creation story. You know, everything is perfect. Everything is clicking along nicely. then comes the forbidden fruit, and everything goes south really fast, right? So, as Reformed Christians, we understand it, or we teach it as, we live in a broken condition, right? It is a condition that everything in creation must deal with. So it's not just humanity, it's everything. Everything lives and what? Dies. Right. And it's this creation. It's we, as people, we think, well, we can set up systems that will be good. No. Even our systems that we put in place are broken because they are created by broken people.
Right.
You know, so I don't care what side of the spectrum you sit on, if it's the side I agree on or the side I disagree with, they will not be perfect systems. They will never be perfect systems. This is why churches have issues. Churches have issues because it's filled with people, right? And there's no way around that, right? When it comes to people, we're part of it, right? And so we do our best, we try our hardest, or we should try our hardest, and yet it still won't be perfect, right? It still won't be perfect, right? Because we're part of this broken condition, right? So the primary thing that we should celebrate about this Last Judgment is that God is coming to put things right, right? It shouldn't be something that we are afraid of or cower from. It's the return of Christ. It should be a glorious and exciting thing for humanity, right? And this is what we must focus on. Why should we be afraid of something, of Christ returning? It's a wonderful thing. That's a wonderful thing, right? We should not be afraid. It should be something that will be glorious for the world,
So
right?
this restoration maybe speaks to the people who have universalist idea of salvation. That no matter what you do here, you're going to be restored the day, and everybody's going to be together
Yes.
in what is supposed to be the heaven.
I
realm.
would think so. I mean, I'm not
Yeah.
very well versed on universalism, but I would imagine possibly this is where they would plug in that, it all comes back together. And, for us, it's not our job to deem who's in, who's out, right? As Guthrie already said. That shouldn't be our goal. We're not the ones who do that.
The judges.
Right, exactly. So we just worry about living, following, imitating Christ's life, and that's it, right? And do what we're supposed to do. But yes, I would imagine so. All right, let's get back to where we... All right. Hope for the restoration and renewal of all creation does, of course, involve a final judgment. In the ominous words of the Westminster Confession, consistent with the writing of Paul in Romans 2, all must appear before the tribunal of Christ to give an account of their thoughts, words, and deeds, and to receive according to what they have done in the body, whether good or evil. If that were the whole story, the medieval pictures of the Last Judgment would be justified, right? In fact, they would be too optimistic. For no one will survive if salvation depends on absolute purity and obedience demanded by God. All of us would have to look forward to the end with stark terror. Who of us, no matter how moral or religious, will not be counted among the wicked for our failure to love God with our whole being and our neighbor as ourselves? That's rough. I wouldn't want to go near those scales. That's tough. That is a hard thing to do, right? That's a hard thing to do. The whole picture changes as soon as we remember who the judge will be. Not a vengeful or even an unbiased blind judge, but Christ himself. The one who will judge sinners is the very one who loved and gave his life for them. The triumphant judge who stands at the end is none other than the dying Jesus on a cross, who has already taken the judgment of God on himself for the sake of the whole world. We think again of two confessional statements we have quoted before. We should not then fear the Last Judgment and have a horror of it, Calvin asks in his Geneva Catechism. No. since we are not to come before any other judge than he who is our advocate and who has taken our cause in hand to defend us. What comfort does the return of Christ to judge the quick and the dead give you? Asked the Heidelberg Catechism. That in all affliction and persecution I may await with head held high the very judge from heaven who has already submitted himself to the judgment of God for me and has removed all curse from me. Because the judge will be this judge, we can look forward to the final judgment not with terror, but with head held high, right? So, yes, there will be a judgment, and the good thing is that it is our advocate who will be doing the judging, right? Now, it's not an opportunity for us to turn to our neighbors and say, you know, aha, you know, you haven't listened to me for all these years, you know, it's going to be hot where you're going. This is wrong, right? This is not what we are called to do, right? We are called to gently present the gospel with love, with kindness, just as Jesus did. Jesus didn't walk around saying, turn or burn, turn or burn. No, he offered his kingdom to people. He offered a way, right? He did it with love, with kindness, with patience. You know, he didn't force it on anybody. But, you know, what did he tell his followers? You know, if they don't listen to you, dust off your shoes and keep going.
Right.
Walk to the next town. Check the next village. And so that's important that we understand that. All right, well, this is way too big to knock off in one section. So do me a favor. Write down
Roman numeral
1, 2, 3.
5.
Yeah, Roman numeral 4, paragraph 3. And I'll know where to go next week. We might be able to chunk this next week and finish this up. All right, we will see you next week.